Okay. Cathy Hall-van den Elsen is a retired academic at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology in Australia, as well as an independent scholar and art historian. She earned her degrees from La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. She majored in Spanish and honors and then went on to earn a master's in Spanish and a PhD in art history. She worked for a period of time as a senior manager of the academic development group in the College of Business at RMIT and as a senior lecturer in RMIT's School of Management. Previously, she lectured in art history.
Art history is a passion of hers, and one of her biggest accomplishments has been contributing to the recognition of the life and work of Luisa Roldán, a Spanish female sculptor from the Baroque period. Dr. Hall-van den Elsen is the leading expert on Roldan and recently published a Spanish monograph about her called Fuerza e Antimismo. In addition, Dr. Hall-van den Elsen has recently completed another book in English about Luisa, which is set to be published in 2021. Though she loves art history, her most recent work was associated with transnational education. Her presentation is titled Finding Luisa Roldán, The Challenges and Rewards of Uncovering the Life and Works of a Woman Artist. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Cathy Hall-van den Elsen.
Hello. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And thank you to Dr. Valerie Hegstrom for her kind invitation to visit BYU to speak about my experiences researching the life and work of Luisa Roldán. It's wonderful to be here. This is a beautiful campus in a beautiful setting. The university that I belong to is smack bang in the middle of a very big city, and it's not at all beautiful. So you're very lucky by comparison. So I'll give you just a quick overview of Luisa's life for those of you who may not be familiar with it. She was born in 1652, daughter of the renowned Sevillian sculptor Pedro Roldan. Luisa and her siblings were surrounded by a close circle of sculptors and painters and gilders and carpenters who collaborated with her father, and they signed guarantor for all the work that he did, just as he signed for them, and they sponsored his kids when they were baptised, just as he sponsored theirs. So there's a real sense of community about Luisa's early years. And when she was 19, she married a young sculptor, Luis Antonio de los Arcos, his name is, against her father's wishes. During the next 10 years, that's the first 10 years of their marriage, the young couple lived with his parents in Seville and had 6 children, 2 of whom survived childhood. They may have continued to work with Luisa's father, but we don't know that for sure. Luis Antonio won commissions for freestanding sculptures that went on Holy Week floats that were carried through the streets of Seville during Holy Week. In Cadiz, a city a day away by donkey, Luisa was feted by the Cadiz City Council, won commissions for the cathedral and other local churches. And then when they were both 37, they took their family to Madrid, just in time for her to baptise her 7th child, 5th daughter, in March 1689. She became sculptor to the King's Royal Chamber in 1692 under the Habsburg Carlos II. She held that title also under the next king, who was a Bourbon, Felipe V, until her death that is Luisa's death, in 1706. So that just gives you a sense of the basic dates that we're talking about. So best known for her intimate terracotta groups representing the Virgin Mary and the Christ Child, Luisa also produced life-sized sculptures in wood designed for churches in Andalusia, in southern Spain, and also for floats that process through Seville streets during Holy Week. Although public awareness of her name has remained a constant in Spain, until recently little was known about her life, and unreliable attributions abounded. Now, I have indulged myself. Last night I added another 20 slides to this slideshow because I thought, I can't leave that one out. So, but I will go fairly fast through these. So the previous one was obviously the Virgin and Child. Here we have the vision of the Christ child to San Diego de Alcalá on the right-hand side. Down the bottom, we have the ecstasy of the Magdalene. I was talking to Eric a couple of nights ago, and we were talking about she certainly didn't go for the bachelorette look. She certainly went for the survivor look when she did images of the Magdalene. Significant suffering involved in those depictions. So that's a recently discovered work on the left in Austin, Texas. And this is a relief sculpture about 35 centimetres by 25 centimetres in the cathedral in Santiago de Compostela. So that's kind of the vibe you can expect when you talk about Luisa's terracottas, most of which were done late in her life. So the floats, the life-size floats that she does are mostly in Seville, and what's striking about them, apart from the fact that the authorship is fairly uneven, so it's very, very clear when a work's by Luisa, but there are works in floats that her husband signed that are very clearly not by her and may in fact be by her husband or may be by someone else, and the figures have been replaced by the Brotherhood in the past 350 years. They tend not to keep fabulous records because they're not art historians. So this is an image of St. John the Evangelist from that previous float. So this is where he is. And this is a fairly typical work by Luisa where you actually, this is a wooden sculpture, but you have a sense that this person wants to communicate with you. He's not just there to look good. He's not just there looking down or holding a stick or whatever. He's actually, there's a very, very human element to a lot of her stuff, her wooden stuff. Then the very next year, she was asked to work on this float with her husband. This is called the Exaltation of the Cross. And some of the images that you see there, this is very recently restored, these figures, so that's why, and the restorer took the photos, so that's why they're kind of bright and shiny and just been, you can imagine him just finishing buffing them up so they look gorgeous. So just samples, they're the angels on the four corners of the float. And then around the float, there are 8 what are called medallones, which are low-relief sculptures that tell the story of the Passion of the Christ. So it really is quite a complicated piece of work because you're dealing with angels and over life-size figures, and then you've got relief sculptures, and you're also working with the carpenter who's building the base of the float as well. And what's interesting in this is that work on your left. This one kind of echoes or repeats the scene that's actually on the top that's the life-size figures involved in. So interesting work, you must agree, I think. This is a photo of the work from around about 1930. So what it shows is that the placement of the figures alters over time. So the Brotherhood committee might decide, no, we think we need that thief to be on the other side, or we think we need someone to be on the front, or so you can track the kind of the history of taste in a way when you look at these photos over time. So the four angels here on the very corners, and then they're the relief sculptures there. Yeah. So this is a little work in Toronto that I've been trying to persuade the museum about its authorship. But when you compare that guy's face with the angels that I just showed you, there's absolutely no doubt at all. So that was just, those photos were just taken last week when I was in Toronto. So, aspects of her biography that appeared in the first 200 years after her death in 1706 have been uncritically repeated as a kind of mantra, and over time they've become part of the popular mythology that surrounds her. The accounts that remain in popular consciousness relate to her amazing talent, her very Christian upbringing, which is kind of odd because I've never seen a Spaniard talk about another Spaniard saying how Christian their upbringing. Anyway, her self-sacrificing actions as a dutiful daughter on her father's deathbed, her authorship of Seville's beloved Macarena, which she didn't actually do, her unhappy marriage to a scoundrel husband, and her self-portrait as St. Michael, smiting her unfortunate husband in the guise of the devil. I'll show you more of that in a minute. So with the exception of Palomino, the first guy who knew her personally and said she was a fabulous artist, none of the stories that are in popular consciousness can actually be substantiated. Not the story about how she raced home from Madrid to Seville on hearing of her widowed father's ill health, because actually her mother outlived both her father and herself. So the fundamental tenet of that whole argument, it just falls apart when you think about it. And especially not the eyewitness account, written 250 years after the event, of Louisa's abduction by the wicked man who rode up to her house on a horse in the dark of night and took her to the house of a family friend while he waited for a priest to marry them. So when I started, before the internet, yes, there was a before the internet, we had no birth certificate, no death certificate, one excellent article about her that did more than repeat the mantra, written in English by a woman from New York. Very few confirmed known works. We had lots of works whose owners thought were by Luisa. Inconsistent attributions, and Spanish books on Golden Age sculpture that concluded with images of her father's altarpieces with comments like, oh, the Golden Age finished when he died. After that, Spanish sculpture really went downhill very fast. So my interest in Luisa was prompted by a sense of frustration. So the questions that I asked about her didn't seem to be easily answered. Over the course of the last 30 years, some have been partially solved, but some remain unanswered. So my challenge on commencing my master's degree and then a PhD was to find out what I could to reduce the knowledge vacuum about her life and work. I was hoping to develop a nuanced understanding of her life in Andalusia as Pedro Roldan's daughter and as an independent sculptor, and in Madrid as sculptor to the King's Chamber. What did that mean? When I started, I sought every piece of information that I could find that had any potential tangential relationship to my task. I naively assumed, I can laugh now, that I'd find the answer in books, as I had in my undergrad studies. So I looked for the book about women and law in early modern Spain, and I couldn't find it. So I went to the law department, to the head of the law department, just bowled in and said, "G'day, I'm from Australia and I'm looking for the book." And he smiled gently at this naive idiot and said, "Well, when you write it, come back to me and I'll write the foreword for you." So I looked for the book about ordinary women's lives in early modern Spain. I found stuff about the repressed lives of noble women. I found some stuff about nuns and prostitutes, a bit about actresses who were almost as bad. But there appeared to have been no women who didn't fall into those categories in the books that I found. And that confirmed, of course, the suspicions of the writers that there were virtuous women and there were bad ones. In comparison, working class women weren't mentioned in enough detail for me to develop an idea of the context in which she worked. So I'd think, so, where would she have bought her food? How did women get food? Nothing. So I'm talking years ago now. It's better now. How did she do this work without disgracing the family name by, being involved in physical exertion when she was working? So there were all these questions, but I couldn't find answers. Then texts on Spanish sculpture itself were relatively few. The glories of El Greco and Velázquez and Murillo had overshadowed those of Martínez Montañez and Alonso Berruguete. References to Luisa were even fewer. According to the almost exclusively male historians whose work I accessed, including the ones I mentioned, Pedro's daughter had run off with a lowly apprentice, after which he'd had a miserable life and thereby was hardly worth a mention. So then I looked for the texts on how to conduct research on obscure women sculptors who weren't members of the nobility. And strangely, they weren't to be found. So my rather nervous supervisor was probably right when he observed that I'd be safer writing about equestrian portraiture. But somehow the idea just didn't appeal. So as I set off to Spain with husband, babies, a couple of suitcases, and not very good university-level Spanish, I defined my task loosely. Just find out what you can about this woman and we'll figure out everything else later. So I'm running out of time already, so I'm going to have to, I might edit this as I go along. Okay, great. So the development of an identity in the field of art history often begins with a biographical sketch in a volume of anecdotes that illuminate the virtuosity of the members of what Ernst Chris referred to in 1934 as the community of geniuses. In the centuries following the publication of Vasari's renowned lives of the eminent painters, sculptors and architects, a number of publications appeared that emulated his work. Vasari, of course, affirmed perceptions of the superiority of Italian art. Those who came after often used extracts from his and each other's texts, mixing theory with brief portraits of selected artists, whether northern, Italian, Spanish. So today, for contemporary researchers wanting to confirm details or add to these historical biographies, state, church and private Spanish archives contain documents from the early modern era, primarily signed by men. That's purchases, sales, agreements, contracts, dowries, debts, powers of attorney, rental documents, testaments, loans, etc. Surviving documentation records the activities of some noble women, often because of their parentage or wealth or marriages or roles in society or at court. However, when the subject is a woman from the working classes, the research process rarely uncovers much documentation, partly because Spanish laws relating to women prevented their full involvement in legal processes. So besides the baptisms, marriages and burials that are acknowledged in church records, the activities that women were involved in may sometimes have to be accessed through the interpretation of information about their family, male family members. Okay, so rather than provide you with an account of my journey over the past 30 years, which would take quite a long time, I'll share with you 4 issues that illustrate the challenges and the lessons and the rewards. So, Santiago Montoto's publication in 1920 of one of the most notable events of Luisa's youth seems to have established a set of assumptions for 20th century writers. So based on the marriage declarations, the account of Luisa's marriage to Luis Antonio conveys the legal steps that were taken to facilitate her marriage to a man of her choosing, without her father's consent. The church arranged for her to stay in the house of a family friend before her marriage. This was an unusual step, but hardly scandalous. But in the 100 years since this event was discovered, it's borne the fruit of fevered imaginings about the calibre of the man she married and the life that they shared for 35 years. Until recently, no one realised that actually 3 of her sisters also married without their father's consent, which may say more about the father than about Luisa and her creepy husband, or the man that people assumed was creepy, because he wouldn't have married without the father's consent otherwise. Most of Pedro's children have seem to have chosen colourful matches. Besides his daughters marrying without his consent, one fiancé was hiding in Seville jail from the Roldan brothers and brothers-in-law who wanted to kill him, and he thought that the jail was the safest place to be until he actually got the Archbishop's permission to marry. Marcelino, Luisa's little brother, the oldest of the 2 surviving sons, was chased all the way from Cordoba to Seville by his fiancé's brothers because they wanted to kill him. So in spite of this interesting family trait, I'm still literally, 2018, I'm still literally reading references to Luisa's husband of 35 years as the creepy guy who did the wrong thing, which I find a little bewildering, I have to say. So I was intrigued by the fact that a young woman, oh dear, sorry, I'm not sure why that's, okay, sorry, I'll skip that. Now, a young woman had moved outside the confines of what I thought, based on my reading of the literature of the day, were immovable behavioural parameters. But the transcripts of the interviews conducted in the Archbishop's Palace with Luisa and Luis Antonio and 2 witnesses who were known to both families reveal a courtship that's recognisable today. The bringing of small gifts, the quiet conversations, the growing closeness. And Luisa testified that all her life she's known Luis Antonio. He's been an apprentice in her house. For a year they've been filled with love and wished to marry, during which at different times they've given word of marriage to each other, him promising to be her husband and she to be his wife. Because her father does not want her to marry him, the marriage has not occurred. And now that she's at liberty, she was removed from the house, she wants to fulfill her word and marry him of her own free will. And the interview transcript actually says, "Are you speaking of your own free will? And do you need someone to support you during this interview?" And she replies, "I'm an independent person. I know my own mind. I know I want to marry this guy. I need no one standing next to me to tell you that." So it's really kind of, whoa, a very, very contemporary, strong statement. So all of this is endorsed by the actions of the officials who represented the Roman Catholic Church in Seville. The 24th session of the Council of Trent in 1563 reinforced the long-standing tradition of consensus facit nuptias, that is, the fundamental element of a sacramentally valid marriage was an exchange of vows freely given in the absence of impediments and in the presence of a priest and 2 witnesses. So tick, 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 yep. So I'm still puzzled as to why Luis Antonio is a big creep. Anyway, so I'm going to rush through. You'll be familiar with the, maybe you'll be familiar with Vives and Leon, The Perfect Wife, and On the Education of a Christian Woman, 1584, 1523. You may also be interested to see this from 1953, a guide to how to be a good wife. Be sweet and interesting. Be a good wife always knows her place. And here, listen to him. Let him speak first. Remember that his issues are more important than yours. Oh, I think it's delicious. I sent it to my daughter, but she didn't reply. Nah. Okay, so we've got that kind of stuff going on in early 1700s, late 1600s as well. As well, we've got challenges to these views, both robust and subtle, appearing in the literature of the time. Some women are portrayed as being prudent and intelligent, and other are superficial and lacking seriousness. The variety of these approaches suggests that Vives and Leon, who were writing for a noble audience, certainly presented a point of view, but the contemporary theatre shows that actually it was really a more fluid approach to understanding life's challenges was sometimes adopted. Even in early modern Spain, human behaviour, morality, gender roles were explored openly, canvassing a variety of views. And paintings of the period do show women in the streets, and not all of them were nuns and prostitutes. So here we have girls at a window, and when I first learnt this painting, I was told they must be prostitutes because normal women, normal working class women would not stand at open windows. Now I'm thinking, you know what? It was probably a really hot day. They probably just wanted some air. It gets very hot in Seville. So my argument is that the strongly disapproval description written in 1920 of Luis Antonio's assault on Luisa's chastity more than likely reflected his own view rather than the 17th century reality that Luisa and her sisters and brothers were living. And for me to understand that was a really important piece of learning. So you've got this document, this view, this perspective, but then if you go back, you start from the beginning, you unpack, you check assumptions, you consider context, all of a sudden this authoritative view of 1920 is less authoritative than you may have thought when you first read it as an undergrad. So I'm going to skip a little now and talk very briefly about Luisa's job in the Spanish court. So she moved from Andalusia to Madrid in the late 1680s. And as a sculptor in the Spanish court, she didn't fit easily into an established social category. The court had long fostered assumptions with painters, the most fortunate and astute of whom found themselves in positions of relative esteem. Velázquez, of course, the most renowned painter of the Spanish court, was elevated to noble status, and part of his elevation required him to claim that he did not seek financial reward for his art. His engagement in physical exertion for financial gain would have reduced the likelihood of any potential claim to nobility. So Luisa would have anticipated or aspired to at least two potential sources of income: a regular retainer, a ración, that assured an employer such as the Royal Palace of her availability for projects, and or ayudas de costa, additional sums granted to cover the costs of producing specific works for clients. So some artists at Madrid's court managed to receive other benefits, such as accommodation, the granting of which was based on the application of very, very odd rules and precedents and comparisons that I haven't got time to go into now. This is Luisa's reception piece for the court. It's a little over 2 metres tall, and you think, yeah, it's a St. Michael, okay. But I thought what I'd do, this is my madness last night, I thought what I'd do is I'd show you some details here of this work. Just to show you, because when you walk around it, it's very difficult to get access to it, but when you walk around it, these figures really do want to communicate with each other and with you as well. And they're quite amazingly carved. Those wings are massive, and the power in that rather elegant arm is very, very strong, very forceful. The way that she carves the wood in the skirt is, a wonder to behold. And then we've got the poor old devil that some historians think must be as so lifelike, it must be a portrait of her husband, which means that she must be St. Michael, which means that they were right all along in that the relationship was bad from the start. It never got better. So you can see the veins. She really specialises in veins. And her brother-in-law was the painter. He painted a lot of her work, and you can see he rather cheekily wrote, Tomás de los Arcos lo pintó. So Thomas de los Arcos painted this. He's written it on the bottom of the sandal. So the bottom of this sandal here. So, whoops, I'll stay with that one. So what I was going to say about the court was that it's very easy to read the letters that she wrote to the king that say things like, I'm poor, please give me some money to feed my children. You have to actually understand that that's the way that everyone wrote to the king. I'm poor, please give me some money to feed my kids, or please give me a house. And one of the letters that's often quoted is, I don't have accommodation. I need a room in the Casa del Tesoro. And you think, oh, okay, so she's looking for some accommodation for a family. And then you find out that actually the Casa del Tesoro is this really important building where visiting nobles stay and where Velázquez used to live. And you think, oh, okay, so she doesn't just want a house. She actually wants a house in a strategically important position in Madrid. So you have to kind of read the desperate pleas for money, not with cynicism, but with caution. And then you have to actually find, well, how significant are these letters and how unique are these letters? Okay, I'm going to skip the next thing. I'm going to tell you a funny story about my last funny story, I promise, about how one can be quick to make a judgment, and it may not always be the best idea. So I was giving my first conference paper in ages. I decided in my wisdom to write about her family's poverty, how she could have survived in Madrid with a husband and 3 kids on a daily retainer that was just enough to buy 2 loaves of bread. Based on my list of all the income that I could find in the Royal Archives, things would have been really tough. To support my idea, I'd found a great quote from a letter that said up the top, commerce is dead, 40,000 artisans are unemployed, beggars are dying of hunger, every day crimes are being committed in the streets so that they can get bread. And I thought, yeah, So that's the reality she's living. So I gave this paper and the audience were, oh, it must have been terrible, and oh, how did she cope? So after the paper, on my way back to Australia, I stopped into Madrid's Legal Historical Archive to see what I could find. Popping into archives is a bit of an occupational hazard. I randomly chose a year and a scribe's name from my Excel spreadsheet among the 800 or so books I hadn't reviewed yet. When it arrived and I unwrapped it and I opened it literally randomly, it fell open on a page that recorded the purchase of a slave by Luisa's husband for the price of her annual retainer from the royal palace. In the very year that I had proclaimed that she was desperately poor. So they clearly had a second source of income that I didn't know about. So I laughed out loud, which doesn't often happen in archives, because the discovery reinforced my firmly held view that her life and work remains very much in the realm of unfinished business. Historians like me can opine with great certainty, just as those in the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries did. But in the end, we will continue to find evidence, surprises, new works, like this Esse Homo on the left. It's discovered just a couple of years ago, and compared to that is a confirmed work by Luisa in Cadiz Cathedral. That's confirmed because they found a piece of paper in the head that says this work is by Luisa. This on the far left fell off the second tier of an altarpiece about 6 months ago in a little church outside Cadiz, and someone picked it up and put it back together because it had split open, and looked at it and thought, oh, hang on a minute. That looks a little bit like those 3 confirmed works that we know are by Luisa. So, you know, the sculptures are going to fall off altarpieces and things are going to be discovered, and you just have to be prepared for surprises. So, she was an unarguably resilient, productive woman. She changed circumstances very easily, moving cities, adding terracotta to the wood that she was initially known for. We need a more nuanced perspective about her. Alison Posker observed that it's only as we study early modern people in their own context, neither completely isolated from larger societal issues nor completely subordinated to them, can we come to a better understanding of women's roles and the complex influences of social forces on their roles. So long as we maintain an agnostic approach, expecting surprises, welcoming contributions, carefully unpacking their implications, we will, over time, build a mature understanding of how she came to represent a moment in Spanish history as a woman and a sculptor. One firm piece of evidence that we can rely on is the response from the only biographer who actually knew her, Antonio Palomino, on seeing one of her last works on the left-hand side that was very badly damaged in the Civil War. I went to visit this sacred image before it was taken from this court, when Don Luis de los Arcos, already a widower, had it in his room on a cabinet, covered with a cloth. As he uncovered it, my stupor was such that it seemed irreverent not to look at it on my knees, because it truly represented the original. After having admired and examined it for a long time, we went to sit down. And looking at it again, I told Don Luis that if he did not cover His Majesty again, I would not sit down. So much was the respect and the reverence that it caused that I am at a loss to describe it. Sorry, I've been a little long. That's it.
Dr. Hall-van den Elsen creates a clear picture of the bold and impressive sculptor Luisa Roldán's life as a female artist in Spain at a time when women's lives were not recorded. While Luisa's art continues to hold significant value, understanding the woman behind the pieces to give credit to is a beautiful work that we've seen a portion of today. I felt inspired by Dr. Hall-van Elsen's simple mission, to find out what she can about this curious woman. There is both beauty and benefit in merely understanding women from different times and places that were not given proper voices in their time or in the resources were provided today. With that said, a large portion of Luisa's story can be explained by the lack of it in our texts. As a result, the story of finding the facts through uncovering, debunking, and serendipitous run-ins with crucial artifacts are significant in telling the overall story of a woman who lived over 300 years ago. The principles upon which Luisa's story has not been told is revealing of her time. A similar situation was represented by Mary Eyring 2 weeks ago in uncovering the stories of women in early America being blamed and wrongfully taking the blame of their miscarriages. Written by men, their history was miscommunicated or forgotten. As long as the gaps in our history books and course curriculums remain, this pattern is sure to continue. We thank Dr. Hall-van Elsen for filling this gap with us today.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to start off the Q&A after we give one final round of applause because it is already 12:50. If any of you have class, you're welcome to leave right after we just thank her one more time, and then anyone else can stay and give more questions. So thank you. So I'll start the first question. If anyone else has questions, you can line up on this side of the room by the microphone. So one thing I was wondering is when you discovered early in your research that there was not a lot of information about Luisa Roldán, what was it that sparked you to keep looking and gave you the idea that there's got to be more out there, and what continues to motivate you to keep looking for more information?
Thank you. I think the strength of her work and the fact that when I talk to historians or art historians in the US or the UK or Spain, they go, "Oh yeah, Luisa Roldán, It drives me nuts because I think actually she really deserves more attention. And it's just it's a kind of one of those weird, wacky missions. This is what I really need to do. And I can do it because I've been there and I've done the archival research and I've seen the work. And a lot of people haven't. Some of it's hiding in little churches and some of it's in private collections and stuff. And I just keep on slowly doing it because it needs to be done. That's all.
You mentioned earlier about how her works were signed by her husband typically, but they were still acknowledged that it was credited to her. Yeah. How common was
Okay, so
that?
she couldn't sign a legal document because she was female and she wasn't widowed. So widows could, married women couldn't. So Luis Antonio would sometimes sign a document that referred to a work by Doña Luisa. He signed the works for the floats, for example, and comparisons with some of those works and some signed works by Luisa make it very, very evident that, okay, so that's hers, that isn't. In her early days, she was pregnant almost, for the first 10 years of her career, so her production was much more limited than it might have been, and you just kind of need to work through that, and after you've seen enough to trust your judgment and to say, so the last couple of slides that I showed with the really obvious comparisons, there's kind of no doubt there. There is no signature, but we've got the document for this one that is signed by Luis Antonio, but it actually talks about Doña Luisa's Virgin of Solitude. So it's, you just need to kind of draw the lines and, and eventually trust yourself.
My question kind of refers to the last one. So since her husband signed for her work, would he have also received some sort of payment for that work? You mentioned she had a retainer, but would some of their extra income that you discovered have come from maybe his
Well, I've
being
got
paid for her
a
work?
really annoying document that I found in Antwerp where he signed a document with an art dealer and negotiated around something that he calls mercancías, which is merchandise. So I don't know if he was selling underwear to an art dealer or if he was selling terracotta stuff to the art dealer. And I've looked into the art dealer, but I can't find a cross-reference back from the art dealer to Luis Antonio. So it's a massive jigsaw.
That makes sense, yeah.
Without, you know how annoying jigsaws are when you can't do the outside edge? So you don't actually know where the outside edge is. It might just keep going.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. That's
Thank
my
you.
story.
Yeah. Thank you.
What do you think is the benefit of making women of the past seem more subordinate than they actually were?
I can't speak for contemporary academia, but in the past, the male writers in Spain very often quoted each other generation after generation, generation before generation, and often didn't actually think or critique what the previous generation has thought. So through the Franco period and, in the centuries before that, historically, women have had a subordinate position in society and in law in Spain. And you actually need to really look hard to unpack, to understand that that may not have always been the case and that there are exceptions to that rule. And unless you actually want to do that, it's kind of easier and it's safer and it's, I'll just repeat what that guy said. Whereas I actually think it's better not to repeat what that guy said until you're absolutely persuaded that what that guy said is accurate. Even if it takes longer and it's more annoying. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm so short. All right, So my question, I was really struck by what you said about how most of the documents about women were either, those two extremes. They were saints or sinners. They were wealthy. So how do you advise we go about doing research on women who are not in those categories, who aren't those extremes? Because most of us aren't extremes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So today I don't know how much is being written about working class women. I suppose because of the rise of sociology, that's becoming more common now. But you just have to keep digging and just think, hang on, so the noble women were stuck in their palaces and the prostitutes were out working, but who baked the bread and sewed the clothes and breastfed the kids and did the midwifery and sort of unpack what you do every day when you get up? You might eat bread, you might, drink juice, you might... Okay, so what would they have done, the average woman in the average house, and then how would they have accessed the bread? Were there bakers in the village or did everyone bake their own? So it's literally going back and thinking about who did their washing. And then you have to go back and look up, washerwomen. or look up bakers, or look up artisans, or it's literally that basic. So just think of your own life and then, okay, so how would that have worked? And so I think about Luisa having 7 kids, 6 kids in the first 10 years of her married life, and think, would have, because I've been trying to get a line of work that she did from after she was married till she went to Madrid, and it would have been interrupted quite a bit. She had kids running all over the place, and she was pregnant, and she was living with her husband's family, and he had 6 siblings himself, and that, it's just... So it's just patient digging. And we're lucky now that we've got the internet, but you just don't give up. You just think, okay, well, this is a dead end. Maybe this one will open a door. And as I spoke to you last night, every single person that you speak to, you say, thank you very much for your help. Who else do you suggest I speak to? And they might have a friend in another department or in another part of the archive or whatever, and they might have found a document that relates to women bakers in Seville in the period that you're looking for. So it's a long haul, but in the end it's actually worth it. I mean, I still wish I knew who cooked her food, for example, but I don't know that I'll ever find that out.
All right, thank you.
So thank you so much. That's all the time that we have for our question and answer session right now. But we're so grateful that you could come and talk to us and teach us all about Luisa.
It's a pleasure.